All right, let's dive into our first concept that we are going to talk about this week. What we're going to look at here are the gunas. Now, the gunas are probably something that you're familiar with: rajas, tamas, sattva. The way that we are going to look at the gunas here is in three different parts. One, we're going to look at the gunas and how Patanjali sets the stage for how the gunas function in the world. Then we are going to look at how sattva is different than Purusha. And then we're going to look at how the balancing of the gunas helps us get to Purusha. So let's take a step back for a moment. Deep breath in, deep breath out. What we are going to be talking about this week are concepts that are foundational to classical yoga philosophy. Now, remember last week when I said that Patanjali wrote the Yoga Sutra with an assumption that the people reading it would have a basic understanding of certain philosophical principles and ideas that the Western practitioner does not necessarily have. The Western practitioner is not necessarily well-versed in Samkhya philosophy, in Vedanta, in these Eastern traditions and viewpoints. And so this is part of the reason why these classical yoga philosophy concepts are really hard for us to understand, especially in the Yoga Sutra. Since Patanjali is assuming that we already know what the gunas are, because the gunas are a huge part of Samkhya philosophy that yoga philosophy is based on, Patanjali doesn't spend a whole lot of time defining these terms or explaining them. It's just expected that we already know what they mean. And since we're coming into reading the sutra with that base knowledge, Patanjali doesn't explain anything for us. Now, obviously, if we don't have that base knowledge, you can see where we get confused really quickly, and most of us do. I don't want us to get too caught up in all of these concepts and ideas. While it can be intellectually stimulating to really dive into these philosophical concepts, for the purposes of what we're trying to learn here, looking at these concepts through the lens of principles that we can take back into our asana classes and teach to our students without feeling like we're going in circles or getting confused ourselves, I just want to present how the gunas are functioning, how Patanjali is presenting these ideas, and then bring it back to some of the principles that we can then apply into our classes. So the first thing that I just want to mention here is the importance of understanding that there are two different realms, let's call them, Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is the realm of universal consciousness, and Prakriti is the realm of nature, everything around us. The table that I can touch, the thoughts that I have in my mind, my body, that is all in the realm of Prakriti. The practices of yoga help us move towards the realm of Purusha, but in order to do that, we have to transcend the realm of Prakriti. And that's where we're going to start off with this conversation on the gunas. Sutra 218 is where Patanjali first introduces the gunas. And here is where he is basically explaining what the gunas are. Everything in the world around us, nature or Prakriti, is composed of three qualities, the gunas. Lightness or illumination, that's what we call sattva. Activity, rajas, and stability or inertia, tamas. These three qualities manifest in the world as the elements and in humans through the senses. So, that sentence means that rajas, tamas, and sattva show up in the elements, earth, air, fire, water, space, and in our senses, sight, hearing, smelling, taste, touch. The elements and the sense organs serve a dual purpose in the world. One, for our enjoyment, and two, to lead us to liberation from them. This, I think, is a really important point. It is okay if we live in this world to enjoy the taste of chocolate, to enjoy the sound of music, to enjoy the pleasures of touch. However, if we want to move towards that state of Purusha, universal consciousness, we're going to have to learn how to utilize the senses and the elements to transcend them. And that's a tall order, and it's challenging. Patanjali argues that the benefits of doing so are worth it, that becoming connected with universal consciousness is well worth the effort of learning how to transcend the senses and the elements. However, there's nothing wrong with using the senses to enjoy life. And if using your senses helps you find enjoyment in life, so be it. That's okay. Later on, or elsewhere in the sutra, Patanjali will warn you that if we get too attached to life's pleasures, we're only going to experience eventual suffering. But we'll get to that later. I do think it's important to note that Patanjali does make this distinction that we can live in this world and enjoy it. And there's nothing wrong with that because that's what we have the senses for. The problem is we get attached to that enjoyment, and that enjoyment is always fleeting. And when we get attached, that attachment leads to suffering. So in a sense, the senses are a trap. But we can also use them to enjoy the world, and if that's where we want to remain, there's no problem utilizing the senses in that way. Let's move on to the next sutra here. And before we do, I just want to show you this spectrum of rajas, tamas, and sattva. This is how I like to think of these three qualities. You've got rajas on one side, tamas on the other side, and sattva in the middle. Rajasic energy is active, light, dynamic, and it's represented by movement. I have light here, and even though light was an adjective used to describe sattva in the previous slide, what I want you to know is that light, as it describes rajas, is meant to represent weight. So lightness in weight is what I'm talking about when I say light underneath the rajas category here. On the other end of the spectrum, we have tamas, inertia, heavy, static, slow. I like to think of mud. Mud is that slow, viscous, heavy, static thing that really represents tamasic energy. Water, on the other hand, especially water moving through a stream, is really representative of rajasic energy. And then we have in the middle sattvic energy, which is stable, balanced, awakening, and essence. And stability here is a dynamic stability. So I know stability was used in the previous slide to describe tamas. But stability in a sattvic state is a dynamic stability like a tree. If a tree is really rigid, when the wind blows, it just snaps. If you have a little bit of movement and some flexibility, the tree is still stable because it is rooted to the ground, but it allows for a little bit of waving back and forth. That's what I would consider a dynamic stability, and that's what we would consider a sattvic state. It's balanced. There is an awakening to this state. There's a peacefulness, and this state is really the closest that you can get to your true essence without crossing into the realm of Purusha. So in Sutra 219, the three qualities, the gunas, that are the energetic building blocks of the world around us, they manifest in the world around us on 4 different levels. Here Patanjali is going back to these levels and stages. On the first stage, these building blocks manifest as gross objects. anything that you can see or feel. So our body represents a gross manifestation of these energetic building blocks. We all have sattvic, rajasic, and tamasic energy within us, and we all experience the manifestation of these energies throughout the course of our day. If we're really tired and groggy, there's more tamasic energy. If our mind is racing and we're flitting around doing a bunch of things at once, that's more of that rajasic energy. And if we feel more peaceful, maybe we're in a meditation or in a yoga class and we're sitting, that's more of that sattvic energy present in our world or in our body, in our mind. Then we've got the subtle manifestation of these energies, that which we cannot see but maybe experience. So what I was just talking about, the experience of those energies, maybe that's a little bit more subtle. It's hard for us sometimes to put words to those experiences. That's when we're experiencing the subtle manifestation of those energetic qualities. Then there's the manifest manifestation of the energetic qualities, that which has been named but may not always be seen, heard, or experienced. And the way I like to describe this is, let's take an experience of real peacefulness. Maybe you're trying to describe your experience of peacefulness to someone else in your family, and they just look at you and laugh and say, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never experienced that. That would be an example of something that's manifest. You've had that experience, but another person maybe hasn't necessarily had that same experience. So they know that it's possible, but they haven't experienced it yet for themselves. So it makes it harder for them to understand exactly what it is you're talking about. And then there's the unmanifest manifestation of these energetic building blocks. And I like to use the example of the computer. Before computers were invented, no one knew what a computer was. Nobody really had an idea of what a computer was. This idea had to be manifested. Somebody or a group of people had to come up with the idea of a computer. And you can see where something goes from that unmanifest level to a manifest level where one person suddenly has this idea for a computer and starts working on it and tries to explain it to other people, and other people have no idea what that original person is talking about because they've never actually seen or used a computer. Then the computer is invented and we start to see advertising for the computer, but we've not actually used the computer ourselves. And finally, we get our hands on a computer, we see it and we use it. That would be the example of something, an idea, and a concept moving through unmanifest to subtle to gross. And it's a process. And it's a process of energy, is what Patanjali is saying in this sutra. So unmanifest is something that has not yet been named. And I think what's beautiful about this level is that it exists. It's just that we don't know that it exists yet. So what are we sitting here right now, the year is 2020, what doesn't exist yet in our life that will exist in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? Right now, it's unmanifest. But in this philosophical framework, the idea is that it's possible. The potential is there. We just have to switch around the way that the energetic building blocks are configured to create something new. So we're going to skip ahead now into Sutra 413. The characteristics of an object, thought, or action, whether they be obvious, manifesting on that gross level, or subtle, are comprised of the energetic building blocks of nature. So this is Patanjali just reminding us 2 chapters later that every object, every thought, every action is comprised of these energetic building blocks. The way that I like to think about this, what I was describing to you as the idea of the computer moving through that unmanifest to gross progression, is digital design. So what you see here is a color wheel. And when you're designing something on the computer, we're going to stick with that computer model, and you want to fill an element with a color, you use something called a hex code. And what you're looking at here, you can see that hex code where you see the pound sign FFC 994 and then like a peachy color. So that FFC 994 is something called a hex code. And each color has its own code. And that code is different depending on the number that's associated with each color. So here you see those color spectrums. There's red, green, blue. 84 red, 13 green, 34 blue. That's how much of each of those color elements combine together to create this peachy color that is then assigned the hex code of FFC 994. So I want you to think about this with the gunas, rajas, tamas, sattva. What if instead of red, green, blue, we had rajas, tamas, and sattva, and that number 84, 13, 34 was changed based on how much of each of the gunas were present in each color. And instead of colors, we're getting objects, thoughts, actions, depending on how we configure each of the energetic building blocks. Hopefully that visual, that idea, is helpful for you in understanding how the gunas are functioning and how they're changing and transforming constantly to bring us new thoughts, new objects, new ideas. So in Sutra 414, Patanjali says the unique manifestation of an object, thought, or action in the present moment comes about through the uniformity of transformation in the gunas at any given time. And that's really just explaining what I just showed you. Each thought, each object, each action is a unique manifestation of a different calibration of sattva, tamas, and rajas. And those calibrations are changing in each new moment. Otherwise, we would be the same all the time. We wouldn't have any new thoughts. There wouldn't be new objects. There would be no potential for something like computers to be invented because the energetic building blocks wouldn't be changing. If we didn't have that constant change, there would be no change. Everything would just be the same. Or if the change is happening on a slower level, things wouldn't be changing as quickly. This is how we want to start to understand change. In nature, Prakriti, everything is changing all the time. All the time. And that is what brings us new thoughts. That is what brings us new objects. That is what brings us new actions in our life. Now, we started by differentiating Purusha and Prakriti. Sattva is that state of balance when it comes to the gunas. If we're feeling really depressed, we might be having a higher calibration of tamasic energy. When we're feeling really anxious, we might be experiencing a higher calibration of rajasic energy. When we're feeling peaceful during or after a meditation, we might be experiencing a higher calibration of sattvic energy. And it is that sattvic state that as yogis we are working towards. We're working towards bringing ourselves into a sattvic state and staying in that sattvic state for longer periods of time, such that as we move through the course of our day, since the nature of our world is that it will constantly be changing, we can recalibrate and come back to that sattvic state as quickly as possible. And our yoga practices are designed to help us come back to that sattvic state as quickly as possible. But Patanjali wants to point out that sattva still exists in the realm of Prakriti because it is one of the gunas. And the ultimate goal of the Yoga Sutra and yoga practice is to help us connect with universal consciousness, which exists in the realm of Purusha. So, to access Purusha, or universal consciousness, we actually have to let go of that sattvic state as well. And this is where the Western mind gets totally confused, because it doesn't make sense in our mind why we would want to let go of that peaceful feeling. And Patanjali is telling us there's something more than that. even better than that peaceful feeling. And because sattva is part of Prakriti, we can get attached to sattva. We can get attached to that peaceful state. And that attachment to a peaceful state can bring about suffering. And then we're just stuck in the karmic cycle all over again, which is why Patanjali is offering us this practice of yoga to help us transcend the karmic cycle and reach that Purusha or universal consciousness realm where we no longer become attached to sattva, the gunas, the constant change. In Sutra 336, Patanjali talks a little bit more about this. He says, everything we experience in life is the result of confusing the mind, which is part of Prakriti, and universal consciousness, which is part of Purusha, as the same thing. They are not the same. The mind is not part of Purusha. Our thoughts are not part of Purusha. Sattva is not part of Purusha. Even the subtlest aspect of the mind, sattva, is separate from universal consciousness. By focusing on the distinction between sattva and Purusha through the process of samyama, which we'll talk about more in week 4, you finally gain an understanding of universal consciousness. So in Sutra 336, Patanjali is reminding us that sattva is different than Purusha, and we need to let go of sattva to get to Purusha, or to experience that state. In Sutra 337, Patanjali goes on to say, upon gaining an understanding of universal consciousness, you will receive a spontaneous flash of insight, which includes extraordinary sensory capacity. Finding universal consciousness, connecting, uniting with universal consciousness isn't something that we do. We do our yoga practices to help us build focus, to help us find this sattvic, peaceful state. But then we have to let go. We have to stop doing. We have to become. We have to be in order to open ourselves up to have this spontaneous flash of insight. And once we receive this spontaneous flash of insight, we will then have this extraordinary sensory capacity that will allow us to understand things in a different light, with a different lens. And then we can turn around and live in the world and view everything through this different lens. And this is where we get that word enlightened, these enlightened beings that move through the world and see things in a different way. People that we might have heard of before as being considered enlightened include Gandhi, for example, or Mother Teresa, or Patanjali, or Krishnamacharya, or any of these teachers who have this extraordinary wisdom and sense about them that is unexplainable. They still are living in the world. Enlightenment does not mean that you die. It means that you receive this spontaneous flash of insight and you start to see the world a little bit differently. And then you turn around and you live in the world. And the new challenge becomes, can you live in the world with this new lens and have an impact, do good? The important thing to note here, though, is that it's a receiving. It's a letting go. It's a being. It's an allowing. It's not a doing. We can't practice Purusha. We can't practice enlightenment. We can't practice meditation even. We have to allow it. And what we can practice are things that will help us be able to allow, be able to be. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in the upcoming lectures and in the upcoming weeks.